Hello, and welcome to the GoLIVE Health Foundation Women at Health webinar series. Thank you to all of the sponsors of the series. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Maven. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions throughout the discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator who joins us from Female Founders Fund, Anu Dugal.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anu Dugal, and I'm the founding partner of Female Founders Fund, an early-stage venture fund investing in the exponential power of exceptional female talent. We're privileged to partner with some of the most dynamic founders tackling some of the most pressing problems in the world. And one of those problems where our firm has made some big bets is menopause. Women control 80% of healthcare decisions, yet when it comes to women's health experiences, healthcare is riddled with gaps that speak to the multitude of ways our system has treated the male patient by default. And when it comes to menopause, the gaps are particularly shocking. It's estimated that more than 1 billion women will be postmenopausal globally by 2025. And yet when women go to see their doctors to get help with symptoms, 3 out of 4 leave without being treated. This lack of care comes at an enormous cost, both from an economic and an equity perspective, which we'll talk about today with 2 phenomenal clinical leaders. And I'll now introduce them both. Dr. Stephanie Fabian is the Penny and Bill George Director for the Mayo Clinic Center for Women's Health and the Medical Director for the North American Menopause Society. She has also spearheaded the development of one of the largest clinical databases in this space, the Data Registry on the Experiences of Aging, Menopause, and Sexuality, or DREAMS, which has supported numerous examples of breakthrough research at the intersection of women's aging and their overall well-being. Dr. Neil Shaw is the Chief Medical Officer of Maven Clinic, the largest virtual clinic for women's and family care, an assistant professor of I'm gonna need some help.
Obstetrics,
gynecology, and reproductive biology at Harvard Medical School. He's the co-founder of the March for Moms Association, a coalition of more than 20 leading organizations dedicated to increasing public and private investment in the well-being of mothers. And he serves on the advisory board of the NIH's Office of Women's Health Research. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
So let's dive in. This question is for both of you. We seem to be at a watershed moment when it comes to menopause, where interest from investors, focus from the clinical community, and popular attention have all exploded. To start our conversation off, I'd love to hear from each of you why you think that menopause has emerged as such a critical focus area, particularly now within healthcare.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Well, I think menopause is a time in a woman's life where she's activated, and it is not just hot flashes and night sweats. There are many, many symptoms that come along with menopause. Hot flashes and night sweats are certainly the most common, and approximately 80% of women will experience them, and some moderately to severely. And while we used to tell women they would last maybe a year or two, we know now that the mean duration of hot flashes and night sweats is 7 to 9 years. And a good third of women will hot flash for a decade or longer. So they're significant, they're disruptive, and they can last a long time. But it's more than just hot flashes and night sweats. It's sleep disturbance, it's mood disturbances like anxiety and depression symptoms. It's symptoms like palpitations. Also joint aches we're finding are among the more common symptoms that women experience. And it's not just menopause. So menopause is your last menstrual period. No period for a year is the definition. But we know perimenopause can start 6 to 10 years before that. And women can have some of the same symptoms that they experience in menopause during the perimenopause as well.
Thanks, Dr. Shaw.
Yeah, so I've had the opportunity to talk to you, Anu, recently about this at dinner, and then also with Stephanie a couple weeks back. But I trained with one of Dr. Fabian's colleagues at the Mayo Clinic of the East, Mass General, and was really compelled by this really specialty niche clinic in menopause, where there was so much demand, but there was such little supply, and have been long thinking actually about this. And it has been remarkable to see the amount of traction that a menopause product has had in the market right now, where we have over 100 clients and 1 million covered lives about 2 seconds after turning on the lights, which just shows that there is all this pent up demand. And one of the interesting dynamics that I see in explaining our menopause product as we're introducing it is, I don't know, maybe it's too much honesty or something, but often you're talking to, it's a common thing to be Zooming in 2022. And when you're interacting with health plans in particular, like no one has their camera on. So there's like a dozen people and they're just black boxes, right? And then the questions that come back about the product make it kind of clear that often our prospective clients are asking for themselves, which to me is also just sort of revealing that about the unmet need. And like there's a great curiosity there, but literally the moment you create the opportunity to serve people and fill that gap, the demand is there. I do think that there is definitely a generational difference. Dr. Fabian talked to me a couple of weeks ago about a textbook that she wrote 17 years ago and had to be updated. Millennials are going to menopause, guys. So as consumers, they are different, and we can definitely unpack that. But I think that all of those dynamics are sort of coming to play. And it's also clear to me that as HR leaders and benefits leaders in particular are indexing towards inclusivity, age is part of inclusivity. And that might even be not even the next frontier, but in many ways, maybe the final frontier in terms of making sure that we're creating workplaces that truly support everybody.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. I mean, if you're starting to support women through kind of fertility, it makes sense to kind of continue all the way in terms of supporting them through all these different kind of life experiences. So we've definitely seen that, through Maven and through our investments as well. Dr. Fabian, I know that, as you mentioned, in popular belief, menopause is pretty much hot flashes and that's about it. But the reality is that it comes with a lot more, and there's a broader impact across, I think, many different aspects of women's lives. Would love to just have you give a brief overview of how menopause shows up through its various stages. So perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, as well as just the range and the severity of symptoms and their duration.
Yeah, I think we talked about that a lot on the last question, in that, the mean duration of hot flashes and night sweats is 7 to 9 years. So let's talk about the average age. The average age in this country is 52, but anything after the age of 45 is considered normal. And there's a significant proportion of women who actually go through menopause before the age of 45 and even before the age of 40. And together, those groups are probably in the range of about 7 or 8% of women. So that's fairly significant too. And the way we manage those women who go through early is a little bit different than those who go through at the mean age. But again, symptoms can be all over the place. And I was talking about, when I wrote the menopause book, how I'd never asked my own mother what her experience was. And because she asked me, like, why are you writing this book? She didn't even understand. And I said, well, Mom, what was your experience like? And she goes, I might have had a hot flash once when I went to a cocktail party and I had a glass of wine. And I went, ooh, man, okay. Because that's not the woman that's showing up in my office most of the time. So there are literally some women that don't have any hot flashes or night sweats. They stop their periods and that's the end of the story. But the fact is the majority of women out there are going to have some symptoms. And I have 80-year-olds in my office occasionally who are saying, dear God, when is it going to stop? So the spectrum is all over the map. But the fact is that the majority of women are going to have some sort of symptoms. And these symptoms can be impactful. They can cause women to miss work, to not be showing up at work as their full selves, and they're not as productive as they could be. It can impact women's choices in terms of whether to take a promotion or stay in the workforce. So these symptoms can be incredibly disruptive.
And I guess just for clarification for the audience, how would you define kind of the perimenopause versus menopause period? Because even just perimenopause in and of itself is kind of a newer concept.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. So menopause is defined by no period for a year. And that's in the absence of any hormonal manipulation that would make you stop your periods. And then perimenopause is that time leading up to that when the ovaries are not maybe fully functioning and you might miss a period or two. But that may be a full 6 to 10 years before you stop your periods. And a recent study published just last year showed us that those women in perimenopause can have very much the same symptoms as women in menopause. So the same hot flashes, night sweats, sexual issues like vaginal dryness, et cetera. Yeah. So the same problems can be problematic in what we call perimenopause.
That makes sense. So Dr. Shah, and this question is actually for both of you. What I'm hearing is that the experience of menopause is not black and white by any means and varies, kind of from an individual perspective. Is that kind of how both of you view it, particularly as it relates to kind of gaps in the education for OB/GYNs? How much knowledge do they kind of start with, and how well educated are they in terms of being able to guide their patients?
Well, I think it's notable that Dr. Fabian is an internal medicine doctor. And I think that we start with more knowledge in OB/GYN than we leave with because of the way healthcare is conventionally structured, and exactly why we need innovation, digital health innovation, and disruption. I guess what I would say is, to your point, I think there are not very many like pop culture references to menopause outside of comedy. I was complaining about that at the same dinner, and then Will Porteous, our chief growth officer across the table, was like, Sex and the City too, Samantha's going through menopause. And I was like, he was like, you should rewatch that. And I was like, you mean I should watch that for the first time? but anyway, I mean, as usually it's like played for laughs, and it's really focused on the hot flashes, but it is not a light switch. It's not like you flip right into menopause. It is a multi-phase journey. And as we think about designing a product around it that really supports people well, we've got to think about that. And we've got to think about the fact that it's a dynamic shift. So the way that people come into menopause may not be how they experience it along the journey. We've got to have ways of thinking about how we touch base with people periodically, because their symptoms are going to shift and their needs are going to shift. And we've got to think about it holistically. So we'll probably get into all that. But
great.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's not even just portrayed as a laugh, a joke. It's women are often portrayed as the angry, sweaty, crabby woman who's sort of out of control. And you put that up against these images of an aging, haggard type of woman, and it really gets into ageism too. And I think that has contributed to women not wanting to talk about it or bring it up. That's part of why it seems to be taboo, is because who wants to be associated with an aging, haggard, angry woman, right? So I think part of that plays into how we address this for women, and how do we address it in the workplace, and how do we address it in terms of products and services that we offer to women, because nobody wants to associate themselves with that.
Yeah, there have been, I think more recently, I think it was Gwyneth Paltrow that started talking about menopause. So I think slowly you're seeing more and more kind of pop cultural references, but definitely, to your point, kind of a long way to go in shifting the image, that society has around menopause. So, both of you are obviously cutting edge innovators within women's health. Obviously, have seen a lot of evolution within the industry. I'm curious, when you think about the ways in which we're currently supporting menopause for women today, where do you see the biggest gaps? You have Michelle Obama, who on her podcast talked very openly about HRT and the fact that, this is something she has been a big advocate of. And other women who are starting to speak out about ways in which, they're kind of going through the experience. But I'm curious, from your point of view, is it educating more OBs? Is it, more education for patients themselves? Dr. Shah?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I might answer it in a complementary way to the way that Dr. Fabian may answer it from a clinical perspective is, one, while I have a clinical perspective, it's worth noting that I don't have a uterus or ovaries. So I come at this from like not having any lived experience with this, but really thinking about, allyship and where the current gaps sit at the intersection of a payment model that has never made sense for driving value in healthcare and patriarchy, I suppose. But fundamentally, the root cause of the gap, I think, is, and I think that from a business model standpoint, is like fee-for-service medicine, right? I think Dr. Fabian can talk more about historically why I think there may be some discomfort and even unwarranted discomfort with HRT specifically. But, I think that there is a lot of money to be made in the conventional ways in medicine, in family building and fertility. The TAM in menopause is equally big, but in fee-for-service medicine, you need a fundamentally different model. And I think, when it comes to shifting business models, the brick and mortar system is sclerotic. And that's exactly where I think digital health can have an opportunity to be more disruptive.
Dr. Fabian?
Yeah, I think, you look back and you go, how did we get here? And I've called this the menopause management vacuum before, because I think it's a mix of things. It's one, women weren't talking about it very much, but then we had the Women's Health Initiative study come out in 2002, which really had women abandon hormone therapy because there were some scary reports about the risks associated with hormone therapy, which have since largely been dispelled. So there was that. Then you have this drop in menopause education, in part because I think the Women's Health Initiative sort of drove that a little bit, because, okay, if we're not using hormone therapy, there's really nothing to do about this, right? So we actually did a study published a couple of years ago in Mayo Clinic Proceedings that we surveyed residents in OBGYN programs, family medicine programs, internal medicine programs across the country. And they told us that they were getting, on average, all of those programs, 1 to 2 hours of menopause education, and that's it. And they did not feel comfortable managing menopause when they finished their residency programs. And this has included OBGYNs.
Yeah.
And then you look at OBGYN programs, which have shifted more toward interventional and surgical type specialties. And frankly, menopause doesn't make money, right? So therefore, presumably the internal medicine, family medicine doctors would pick this up, but they say, gosh, that's the realm of an OBGYN. We don't own that. And these are my colleagues, right? They don't see themselves as women's health doctors. And in fact, that was some of the response that we got on this survey was, I don't see menopausal women. Well, I'm sorry, but every family medicine and internal medicine residency program, they have to have a panel. Over half of them are women, and most of them are over 50. They're just not seeing the woman in front of them as a menopausal woman. Yeah. So therein lies half the problem, right? So, and then you have a gap in education of women. Women don't know that there are therapies for them. They frankly come to the Mayo Clinic to see me, and they're coming in with this massive symptoms that they think they're dying. And I'm not kidding about that. They come in, they're gaining weight, they're losing hair, they're sweating at night, they have brain fog. I mean, they think they're falling apart, and they go, what is wrong with me? I'm like, you have menopause. This is menopause. And they're like, what? So, and then there's this perception that there's nothing to do about the symptoms, even if you diagnose it, right? So I think it's a whole conglomeration of things, and it's left this void, this vacuum in the management of menopause symptoms, which we really have to get at, because it's an economic burden. I mean, this is a substantial economic burden globally, right? So it's not just lost work, it's increased healthcare expenditures. It's a big problem, and we really need to, it's not just a matter of, oh, I'm so sorry, you have a few hot flashes. It's a much bigger thing than that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Dr. Shah, I know for you made the transition to Maven Clinic last year after a career as a hospitalist in Boston, and kind of now living and breathing in the world of digital health. You mentioned that there's a lot of opportunity for that to be really impactful for menopausal patients. I would love to hear your views just on how can we increase access to quality care, and secondly, what do you think that should include as you think about kind of that journey for women during that period, and how telehealth can ideally play a role?
For sure. Yeah, I did make that transition about 14 months ago, and I'm still standing. But the role of telehealth isn't to like Zoom with people. Like that's not it. Like, also, when you describe me as a hospitalist, which is correct, like I spent most of my clinical time in the hospital providing acute services. And so, like, especially as an obstetrician, like digital health was confusing. Like, you can't deliver a baby through a screen, right? So I was like, what is this? It's two things. One is that digital health should kind of decouple what people have access to from space and time. What that means is most people in the world, and particularly in the United States of America, have access to whatever is physically proximate to them. So if you live near the Mayo Clinic, you are very lucky, you have access to that. In most of America, you do not have someone who recognizes you as a menopausal woman. They don't think they are managing menopause, and yet they have a huge part of their panel, as Dr. Fabienne said. So one of the opportunities with digital health is, regardless of where you live, your zip code shouldn't dictate what you have access to. The other thing is that, I feel like holistic care has become this meaningless buzzword. I feel like primary care is not a type of doctor in 2022, it's a set of capabilities. And those capabilities are right in the pocket of digital health. It's the ability to be a first point of contact for people, which digital health should be able to do, especially like an app isn't going to fix healthcare. It's the idea that, something like Maven Clinic lives in your pocket and it goes with you. So you're a first point of contact. It's the ability to provide continuity, especially if it's not a light switch journey and it's a multi-phase thing. It's the ability to coordinate services. Sometimes you can have the services be addressed directly through HRT. Sometimes the menopausal transition unmasks things that actually do require higher levels of care, and maybe the weight changes and hair loss or something more serious. And then the last thing is it's the ability to take care of people comprehensively, which is like to not treat them as a uterus instead of ovaries, but to realize that this transition is hard physically, socially, and even mentally, and that you can service them with the type of platform that isn't dependent on a single type of specialty, because healthcare is largely organized around conditions, and it's not organized around phases of life. And I think that's the opportunity with the digital paradigm.
Thank you. Dr. Fabienne, I know, you just touched on the economic consequences that the lack of support around, having resources for menopausal women can lead to. We did a study about 2 years ago, interviewing 250 women to understand kind of where the gaps are, as well as the opportunities. And what we saw through the survey was that $20,000 on average is spent over the course of 10 years of a woman's journey through perimenopause and menopause, which is a significant number. And yet, we still don't have any large brands or services that come to mind when you think about menopause. And so I'd love to just hear, your views on these real economic consequences, particularly for companies, for the women themselves. What is your point of view on this?
Yeah, thank you for that. And we have some data that's actually going to be presented at the North American Menopause Society meeting next week. So this data will be public at that time. But just to give you a little preview of what we found, we actually surveyed about 30,000 women who are receiving primary care within our Mayo Clinic system across 4 different geographic locations, and ended up getting about 5,000 responses. And so we were just, cold asking women 45 to 60 years of age if they were having menopause symptoms or not, and then where they were getting care, and if they were missing work related to that, or had been fired, quit, changed jobs, reduced hours, specifically due to menopause symptoms. And the results were surprising to all of us. So these women were having moderate symptoms of menopause, and most of them weren't being seen for it. We asked them about absences and any kind of adverse work outcome related to these symptoms. And we found that like 13% of these women were actually reporting that they'd had some adverse work outcome related to their menopause symptoms specifically. And about 11% said they had missed days of work in the last year because of menopause symptoms. And the mean number of days missed was 3. So do the math. I mean, let's just figure out what the economic consequence to that is. That's not even counting, women who didn't take the promotion or aren't moving up the corporate ladder. I mean, it's an enormous loss of human capital. What was more disturbing too is that Black women were 3 times more likely to report an adverse work outcome or missing work specifically than were white women. And if women were in the highest quartile of menopause symptoms, they were 15 times more likely to have an adverse work outcome. So that just says directly related to menopause symptom severity. The domain of symptoms that was most tied to an adverse work experience was the psychological domain. So it was those mood symptoms associated with menopause that seemed to be most devastating. So I think the results of this study hopefully will prompt a lot of people to have a wake-up call. Like this is not just a minor nuisance. This is a major problem that we have, and we have to figure out how to address it for women. And I agree, Neil, that digital health is a great solution, and we're actively working on one at Mayo Clinic as well. I think education is a big piece of that that is entirely missing because our medical providers don't know how to educate women on it because they're not educated themselves.
Yeah,
so.
No, absolutely. Dr. Shaw, I know Maven has really been serving menopause patients since it launched in 2014. But as we touched on earlier, it's really been kind of more recently that employers have been actively looking to provide more support for women during this phase, which has obviously led to Maven building out more clinical programming. I'm curious, what do you think about the kind of long-term viability? We often see in employer benefits, you have interest in fertility, maternity, pediatrics, chronic disease, now menopause. What is your point of view on, is this a trend, or do you think that this is something that hopefully will become a permanent benefit as it relates to employers?
I think post-pandemic, I'm going to leave the future prediction business. But, I also think like a midweek, midday webinar, like we should spice it up by being a little bit provocative too. But I think that first, just to clarify, Maven Clinic has been serving people in menopause since 2014. And I think it's because we raised a flag and we're here to serve women and families with the questions that they have. And then as we're building the product and the service and the business, we made sure that we layered in the expertise that matched with people's questions. And then particularly interestingly, the family building space abuts the perimenopausal space, if that makes sense. There are people who are struggling to start their families, and they may be struggling because they're actually in their 40s. And so we've been taking care of people in that way, but we packaged it into a menopause product because of market demand.
Mm-hmm.
And again, actually, truly, genuinely have been very surprised by the degree of traction. And the dynamic underneath this is really similar to what I've observed with almost every other movement that's intersected with healthcare in my career. From the current platforming of maternal health in the White House to even some of the changes that we saw with the way HIV/AIDS were approached in the late 1980s. The common thread is that you've got a vocal group of people who are not even necessarily saying the same thing, but are talking about it simultaneously. And my observation from being in this seat, this is the provocative part. I don't know if they're purchasers on this webinar, but I think purchasers are uniquely sensitive compared to other stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem to demand, bottom-up demand.
Yeah.
I think that's why often purchaser groups end up truly being the tip of the spear in innovation, like in a good way.
Yeah.
And sometimes being really reactive to, but it's very clear that the people that you named is a signal, right? Michelle Obama, Gwyneth Paltrow. I think we're going to increasingly, that this is the one future prediction thing I'll say, is that we're going to increasingly have a growing national conversation about this. Stephanie is going to be in even higher demand than she already is. And I think that's part of what's happening with purchasers. They're very, very sensitive to the optics of that, especially in an era where inclusivity is top of mind.
That makes sense. Dr. Fabian, we talked a little bit about HRT, and I know that in 2002, a major research program known as the Women's Health Initiative released data that linked breast cancer risk to hormone therapy for menopausal symptoms. I'd love to just hear your point of view just on what that data set revealed and how you really contextualize the risks of hormone therapy to patients in terms of the benefits, the risks, and lifestyle factors that also could be a contributing cause.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I could go on for about an hour on that topic, so I'm going to try to do the condensed version right now. But I think the important thing is when those data were presented in 2002, they were presented in a way that reported out the results from women from the age of 50 all the way to the age of 79. And the mean age was 63. So that's not the woman who's in my office. The woman in my office is more like 53. And so they examined those risks all together. And what they said is overall, these risks are, hormone therapy is dangerous and people shouldn't take it. So, but what came about in the last 20 years is as they've reanalyzed the data and broke it into decade of life as appropriate, we look specifically at those women who are 50 to 59 years of age and look at the risk for those women, because those are the women that these data are most salient for. These are the women who are in my office saying hot flashes and night sweats are disturbing my life. So what it comes down to, bottom line, is for those women who are under the age of 60 and within 10 years of menopause onset, typically the benefits outweigh the risks. And so then we get down to explaining, okay, what does it do for breast cancer risk, heart disease risk, bone risk, brain risk? And then I go through all of those things with women in my office. But, one of the things that people are most concerned about is breast cancer risk. And the Women's Health Initiative, it's important to note that there's a difference between women with a uterus and women without a uterus. Women with a uterus have to take the combination of an estrogen plus a progestogen, which protects that uterine lining from growing too much with the estrogen. On the other hand, women without a uterus don't have to take that, and they take estrogen alone. And what we found was that the breast cancer risk differs between those two groups and is much higher in the group of women who have a uterus and have to take a progestogen. It's also important to remember that that study used one particular type of drug, namely conjugated equine estrogens and medroxyprogesterone acetate, which we don't use a whole lot anymore, and we use some different therapies now. So putting that all into context, what is the breast cancer risk associated with the combination drug for women with a uterus? It was more or less 8 to 9 extra cases per 10,000 women per year after about 5 years of therapy. If you break that down even further, it's about an extra case per 1,000. And when you look at that in context, it's about the same as 1 to 2 glasses of wine per night. It's about the same as being inactive. It's about the same as being obese. So it's about the same as some lifestyle factors that are pretty common. And while you wouldn't want to be that extra 1 case per 1,000 after that period of 5 years, that's a rare event, right? If you look at heart disease risk, mostly for women in their 50s, the risk of heart disease is not increased. And some studies, including a Cochrane review, show a decreased risk of breast cancer, or not breast cancer, heart disease risk associated with hormone therapy use for women in their 50s. Bones, we know it helps bones, right? So When women take estrogen, it helps them maintain their bone density. It reduces fracture risk. And then for brain health and Alzheimer's disease risk, for those women in their 50s, there is no increased risk. If you start it later on, yes, there may be an increased risk. So we've learned that timing of onset or timing of starting the therapy is important, and younger is better and older is worse, right?
Yeah. As a follow-up, this study was done in 2002 and we're now in 2022, 20 years ago. Has there been, that you know of, any follow-up studies that, would be more current in terms of looking at this, as you mentioned, relevant to different demographics? So 50s versus 70s, obviously you're going to see different impacts. Has anyone kind of done a more recent study that you think is relevant?
Well, a couple of comments on that. So one, there has been some follow-up of the Women's Health Initiative study, and they had 18-year follow-up with the mortality data associated with that, which was very, very, very reassuring. Mm-hmm. And even when you looked at breast cancer mortality, with either type of hormones, the combination or just estrogen alone, mortality was not increased in hormone therapy users. Breast cancer incidence was increased in the combination, but not in estrogen alone. And actually, mortality was decreased in the conjugated equine estrogen alone group related to breast cancer. So those were key results. If you look at other studies, the ELITE study and the KEEP study were both done since then, both randomized controlled trials, both tried to look at, hormone therapy in younger women specifically. And in general, what those were looking at they were not looking at hard outcomes like heart attack and stroke. They were looking at intermediate markers of risk like plaque in arteries. And what they did show, there was some reduced plaque in arteries associated with the use in younger women. KEEPs did not show a very significant difference, but they had women who were brand newly menopausal, and they were very healthy to begin with. So overall, the results have been reassuring regarding the use of hormone therapy in younger women, again, who are in their 50s and within 10 years of menopause. So I think it's an option. It's a viable option. It's one that's underused by women and by providers.
So this question is around the topic of stigma. This has obviously come up a couple times in our conversation, and I think things are slowly starting to shift from a cultural perspective, but I can imagine that for a lot of women, a lot of patients, there's still a little bit of hesitation around this conversation. And so would love to hear from both of you, just where and how can we make or help women feel more comfortable asking for help, making this an open kind of dialogue and conversation from a societal perspective. It potentially could be through the role that employers take in making this kind of a more open conversation. But yeah, would love to hear your point of view, Dr. Shah.
Sure. And Anu, you probably have a perspective as well from seeing various forms of disruption in women's health, and even in like the category of sectors that are led by female founders. My experience in seeing change in healthcare, which does not happen typically at a really fast clip, is that every once in a while there is a genuine inflection point in adoption of an idea. And we're at one when it comes to menopause, for sure. And I think, the reason that I think that we're at it now is that it is incredibly normalizing just for a company to offer a menopause benefit. I think that mental health was similarly highly stigmatized. It still is, for sure. And like with everything that needs to be adopted, there are the innovators that are at the beginning, and then there's a long tail of laggards, a long tail. But if you look at the traction of mental health benefits and solutions, not only the proliferation of point solutions, but the genuine traction, and even like the JAMA studies showing the value add to employer populations for mental health, it's because there is something very normalizing for to not only offer it, but to make it part of like the routine communication when hard stuff happens, to be like, by the way, you've got access to this or to that. And I think, I'm thinking about the 1 million lives covered at Maven Clinic and how it will hopefully be normalized in the workplace to say, hey, you may not want to talk to your HR leader about this or even your boss, but here's at least a resource. That's the hopeful side. There's also a very pragmatic side that, it's worth pointing out that stigma is largely insidious. And so that's true whether it's racism or misogyny or ageism or all these things. And, Dr. Fabian names some statistics that, people living at the intersection of all those three are truly the most vulnerable, and will really know that we've not even gotten past the stigma, but gotten to a place that is closer to our ideal when people that are living at the intersection of racism, ageism, and misogyny feel like they can, express their problems and have them solved.
Thank you. Dr. Fabian?
Yeah, how to unpack that? I work in a menopause clinic, and so I talk about this all the time, and the women coming in my office want to talk about it. So it's not taboo in my office, but I know I live in a weird world, right? And so I think, what's interesting is my other part of my medical practice is in an executive health practice. Those women are talking about it much more than ever before. And so I think it's part of a dialogue that's increasing, and it's so great to see. And even in my role with the North American Menopause Society, I have never seen this kind of activity around New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes. There is all kinds of demand to talk about this now, and for whatever reason, right? There's an economic impact there, and I think it's been estimated at a $600 billion market, or more than that even. So if it's financially driven, so be it. But we're talking about it now, so I think that's really important. I am happy to see the taboo start to go, and I'm even working on a menopause policy at Mayo Clinic. So just even figuring out who is involved and who would be involved in the creation of a policy. It's HR, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, salary and benefits. It's across the board, and it's much more difficult than I thought it was going to be, because this is across so many different layers of the organization that have to weigh in on this. I saw in the comments that it's kind of where we were when we were dealing with pregnancy in the workplace maybe 30 years ago. I think that's exactly right. We were talking about pregnancy and lactation. Let's just back up a bit. Number one, this is not a disability. It should not be treated as a disability. It's a natural occurrence that will happen to 100% of 51% of the global population if they are lucky enough to live that long. So it's not a disability. We need to learn to talk about it in the workplace like anything else. It's a condition that can cause some symptoms that need to be dealt with. And, some women may not want to disclose that they're having menopause symptoms in the workplace, and that's okay. We should provide them with a way to talk about it where they don't have to bring it up to their manager or supervisor, right? But I think we're getting there, and the fact that we're having these conversations now and trying to sort this out is a promising sign.
Yeah. And I think, to build on that, you've obviously had a wealth of experience serving menopausal patients for, now over 17 years. I'm curious, have you seen a change? Obviously, you just said, from a cultural perspective, we're reading about it, to a certain degree, talking about it. But what about the patients themselves? Are they asking for more holistic treatments? Are they, looking for different solutions? Where were we 17 years ago, and what can a patient who goes to you today, expect?
Yeah, great question. Well, from my perspective, we were full day one in 2005 when we opened our menopause clinic. So there's been a demand for this for a very long time, but we're now up to multiple providers at 3 different geographic locations, and we're still full. So we see thousands of patients per year. And so you just magnify that toward, you can imagine what the need is. Now, is the discussion changing? I think women are coming in they're pretty savvy consumers, the ones who have sort of looked into this before, and they've done some reading, they've done some research. The sources of information out there are often a little shaky, to be honest with you, and so they come in with some ideas that may not necessarily be scientifically correct. And so a lot of this is really correcting misperceptions about what works, what doesn't work, what are the true benefits and risks of therapy. So that's a lot of the discussion that I see going on now, is getting into really the science behind things and making sure that things are evidence-based, because this is such a big market. There's a lot of snake oil out there that's being promoted, and I think women need to be savvy consumers about that.
Yeah. So, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Our last topic is really just the future of menopause. Where we are today, we're obviously making progress, across several different areas, whether it's employers, point solutions, et cetera. But 10 years from now, where do you see this in terms of, having better solutions for women and just a better experience overall for people entering this phase, for women entering this phase?
Neil, do you want to start, or do you want me to?
I'm happy to go. I guess the 10-year vision is one, it's where I hope things are going to go, which is the opposite of what I think Stephanie described as snake oil, right? Because I think family building has a lot of snake oil right now too, because it's hot, right? And so people offer things up, and you've got predatory marketing in healthcare is not only problematic, but it's like people have needs, and so they're desperate. And so if you offer something that looks good, they're willing to adopt it, and that works in the short term. I really, really have hope that it does not work in the long term, by which I mean 10 years. Because at the end of the day, people vote with their feet, and you're either helping them or you're not. And that is what makes healthcare different fundamentally. Like menopause is healthcare. That's what we're talking about here. The other part that I think is critical is we know our primary healthcare systems are broken in the United States of America, much to our detriment. And I hope that while people may come in to a menopause solution because they're dealing with a very specific vasomotor symptom or hot flashes or something like that, we use the opportunity to pull them into the system as a whole, to realize that this is a phase of life where you're being screened for bone density, for cardiovascular health, for breast cancer, for colon cancer, and that much in the same way that we're trying to do for our maternity population, we are taking good care of people with an eye towards their future as well. So that's where I hope this goes in the next 10 years. That's the way to truly drive value and make people better off.
Dr. Fabian?
Yeah, I like that a lot. So we know that now that the menopause transition is a time of increased cardiovascular risk for women. And you have to remember that heart disease is the #1 killer of women. And actually hot flashes and night sweats seem to be a marker of increased risk for heart disease later in life. So this isn't, again, these aren't symptoms that are benign and women should be just patted on the head and sent out. It's a time to really assess risk so that we can make sure that women stay healthy later in life. And I completely agree with that. What does the future look like? I would love to see that women have easy access to digital services for education, for management of menopause symptoms, that there are workplace policies that are supporting women so that they can remain in the workforce, and that we are systematically providing education in midlife. So, how everybody gets the talk before they start their periods at, like 4th or 5th grade. Well, we don't give the talk to women right before they're going to stop their periods. And it's the same process in reverse, and it's every bit as disruptive. So if we could figure out how to educate women in a better way about what's happening to them and what their options are for management of symptoms that may or may not occur, I think that would be great. But I'm encouraged by the fact that we're even here having this conversation today, because I can tell you even 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been doing this.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping, promote the health of midlife women.
Yeah, no, that's both great answers. The only addition I would have is also more emphasis throughout the OBGYN training on this as being a specific phase that just requires a different level of skill and
I would say not OBGYN training, because this is moving to the realm of the internal medicine and family medicine doctors. Yeah. And I would say we need to make sure that internal medicine and family medicine doctors take this up, because I don't think it will ever go back to being in the realm of GYN specifically. Yeah. I don't know, Neil, if you have different thoughts about that, but I think the internists and the family medicine docs need to pick it up.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not necessarily a protectionist, but I think there's definitely shared responsibility there. And I think one of the ways that Maven is able to serve the menopause population, I think this answers a couple of the questions in the chat actually, is the North American Menopause Society has a certification program for people who are specifically trained in menopause. Yeah. And as we're trying to figure out how to populate expertise within Maven Clinic, it would be great to have a NAM certified OB/GYN, but there's not that many of them. It's a few hundred in the country. And that's actually okay. I still feel very confident in our ability to match people with the right expertise because of the fact that we have physical therapists and nutritionists and mental health providers.
Nurse practitioners, physicians assistants.
We have family medicine doctors, right? And so that's exactly to your point. It's connecting people to the right expertise. And clearly there's a gap on the OB/GYN side right now, even if it's the access point. So.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for one final point. In today's audience, we have leaders in population health, digital health, biotech, and more. So would love to just hear one thing that you would like the audience to take away as they think about menopause specifically and the opportunity to improve the patient experience. Dr. Shah, maybe you can start with this.
Ooh, one thing. If I had to pick one thing on the fly with the clock ticking, I would amplify Stephanie's main point, which is the size of the population relative to the number of people who even make it into Stephanie's clinic. And then you think about the fact that the number of people that even mention things to doctors is already the minority. If you think about a funnel, and only 1 out of 5 of them get their needs addressed. That is unbelievable. So whether you are listening as someone who wants to invest or build solutions, that should meet all the criteria for jumping in whole hog. So that's my one takeaway / pitch.
100% agree with that. And if it's not on the side of just arguing for the woman who's suffering for her day, right? This need is just staggering. It's staggering. And just our calculation of the cost of, just missing a day of work is in the billions of dollars in the United States. So we have a need to really better serve women. I mean, we've failed women a little bit in this space over the last, 50 years, and we need to do a better job of supporting them now. And I think this has wide-reaching implications. If women are falling out of the workforce and again, not getting to the C-suite because of this issue, think of the lost human capital. It's like crazy. Everyone, we need to do better. We need to better serve women in terms of medical options. We need to do better in terms of serving women with digital health options. And I think we need to reach women that are falling through the cracks right now. So people who are underserved, we still don't really, I've seen a lot of questions about cultural diversity, and there are many risk factors for having worse menopause symptoms, and that's that intersectionality between chronic disease, social determinants of health, race, ethnicity, education levels, et cetera, and all of those factors play into how women experience menopause. So we are going to better serve everyone if we do a better job of making this accessible to everyone.
Amazing, really helpful takeaways. So we are at about time, and really appreciate everyone in the audience that joined us. I think we touched on some of the questions that came up throughout the conversation, but huge thank you to both of you, Dr. Fabia and Dr. Shaw, for doing this panel today, and just again, more conversation will hopefully lead to more resources and more services for this massive opportunity. So thank you both.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Anu and all of our speakers. Please visit our website at hlth.com to catch up on all Health Go Live webinars. And join us in Las Vegas, November 13th through 16th for Health 2022.